this isn't something I've talked about much in public, but here goes. This should get me in lots of trouble.
Jordan Peterson and Sir Roger Scruton. Don't worry, I've never heard of him either.
Mr. Reagan.
Before we begin, Merry Christmas! I hope everybody out there is happy and visiting family, and if not, maybe the hour that you spend here with me will give you some company this weekend. After all, this is the most beautiful and wonderful of all the holidays. Now, on with the video. Before watching this video, I had never heard of Sir Roger Scruton. Having read up on him briefly, he has instantly turned from never heard of to one of my heroes. He's a hard-right conservative, the arguments with whom I have not yet found disagreement. He is an Anglican, which is the Church of England, and he seems to be a genuinely devout Christian. I will introduce you briefly to Scruton based upon what I've read. Scruton became a conservative in May of 1968 after he witnessed left-wing student protests in Paris. About this, he has said, "I suddenly realized I was on the other side. What I saw was an unruly mob of self-indulgent middle-class hooligans. When I asked my friends what they wanted, what they were trying to achieve, all I got back was this ludicrous Marxist gobbledygook. I was disgusted by it, and thought there must be a way back to the defense of Western civilization against these things. That's when I became a conservative. I knew I wanted to conserve things rather than to pull them down." Scruton has argued that faith in God inspires more beautiful architecture. He has said, "Who can doubt, on visiting Venice, that this abundant flower of aesthetic endeavor was rooted in faith and watered by penitential tears?" And he stands firmly against animal rights activism. He considers animal rights activism to stem from a Beatrix Potter delusion, where animals are all pure and good, and humans are all vile and wicked. I love it. I love everything this guy thinks. He seems to me to be a perfect complement to Jordan Peterson. Let's see what they have to say.
And I'd like to begin by asking each of you, what is the transcendent? What does it mean for something to be transcendent?
I take a position which I attribute also to Kant, that we have a very clear negative understanding of it. We, as it were, advance to the edge of our thinking in so many areas, knowing that although there's nothing further that we can say, that somehow the truth has nevertheless not run out. This is something that we understand very quickly in personal relations. When I address you, I know that I'm addressing something which addresses me too, but from a place where I could never be. I couldn't look at myself from those eyes. And I can't capture the thing that is looking at me from those eyes. But nevertheless, there are leaps of the imagination which can put me in your point of view, and from that point of view I can come to understand exactly what I am, but in a completely different way from simply the ordinary empirical knowledge that I have of myself. And I think that sort of interpersonal understanding, I would say, we can adapt to all the other aspects of our world which are mysterious to us.
Sir Roger mentioned that the transcendent is what we bump up against when we realize our ignorance. You tend to represent the world in the simplest manner that you possibly can that works for what you're doing. And so you don't actually see the world. You see sufficiently useful, low resolution representations of the world. And if they work, then that's fine. There's no need to adjust them, and they're relatively easy to remember and to manipulate. But now and then you have a misapprehension about someone, let's say, and you have a conversation with them, and the conversation goes sideways. And what that means is that the thing that you thought you were conversing with is not the thing that you're conversing with, and that manifests itself in error, right? So error is the place where the transcendent reveals itself. And what is actually revealing itself is the reality that's outside and underneath your perceptions. And so what you see in the world, in some sense, is a set of animated cartoons. And a lot of that is actually a consequence of you seeing nothing but your memory, because your brain is organized so that instead of going through all of the difficulty of having to look at the thing in itself, you look at what you assume to be there. And if you can get away with that, so much the better. But the thing in itself is always much richer than your apprehension of it, which is partly why you make mistakes, but also partly why you can continue to garner wisdom in the world. There's always more there than meets the eye. So it's not some fiction that this exists. What's transcendent is more real than the reality that you perceive.
Let me interpret in stupid American guy terms. Sir Roger Scruton said, "The transcendent is that which is beyond our understanding." Jordan Peterson said, "And we don't understand much." That is really basically what they both said here. And I think that's useful. They're both using language that I think they believe will elevate the idea of the transcendent from some amorphous term that religious people use without precise definition and therefore easily dismissed by academics and scientists to something that must be taken seriously by intellectuals. And I think that that's a sensible thing to do. But by doing this, their language becomes rather esoteric and difficult to follow. What they basically said here is that you don't have to go all the way to the divine or God or to heaven or the human soul or any of these religious concepts to find things that we can define as transcendent. We can find simpler, smaller examples that we can define as transcendent. Basically, the idea of the transcendent, as they're putting it, is that we don't know everything. So we must use tools to understand that which we cannot perceive with our senses. Scruton gives the example of our imagination, which we use to empathize with others. Peterson then adds to that, basically, everything is beyond our understanding. Even when we do understand, we understand in such an oversimplified way that not to accept some kind of system of transcending our understanding beyond our own simple perceptions would be absurd.
Perhaps Jordan might be right that there are these drug-induced experiences where things open up to us because old barriers are suddenly swept away. But in my own case, it is the concentration on the empirical reality, which at a certain point flips from mere sensory understanding to a vision in that of its communicating something to me. And I think this is what literature and art and music do at their best. They redescribe reality so that it is actually communicating something to you. It's not just there as an inert object before you. And that sense of the transcendence is like discovering yourself in a mirror, seeing in the world as a whole that thing in you that you could never identify in words, the subject which is looking at it. And it's not a mystery, but it's something that you can't then explain. And it's the difference between a good writer and a bad writer, of course, is that a good writer will describe something in such a way that the thing described has the soul of the reader in it.
I think he meant to say the soul of the writer, and I think that's true. What he's saying sounds really right to me, but I think if this is right, if the artist can help the observer transcend the confines of human perception, knowledge, and the typical mental processes of the human mind, then the artist is immensely powerful. And this power could be used for good or for evil. And so artists, writers, etc. have immense responsibility to try to influence people positively. And I think this is all absolutely true.
That might be a distinction in part between the thing and the meaningful thing, right? And that's a very mysterious phenomenon. In fact, in some sense, the essence of phenomenon, because that means to shine forth. Yes. As we're surrounded by empirical facts, they're everywhere. There's more of them than we can possibly count, but some of them do emerge and manifest themselves as that conjunction between the factual and the meaningful, and then that's what's gripping. And if you're fortunate, to me, that's also partly what leads us onward, and maybe in something approximating the ascent that you described, is that the set of facts manifests itself as implicitly meaningful, and that means in some sense that there is a call to you that isn't from within you. I don't know how else to put it exactly, because you walk into a bookstore and a book will reveal itself to you, or you have a conversation and part of the conversation will trigger something in you. Or you're reading a scientific paper and much of it's dull, and then all of a sudden there's something that sparks outward that's like that's a portal into the transcendent. And that is a place where the fact and the meaning converge. And that's a phenomenon we don't understand very well. It has something to do with its convergence with the narrative that drives us, whatever that happens to be.
Yeah, I think that's a good way of putting it. Actually, it connects with the general problem of what the humanities are in the university. I've always assumed that in some way or another, if you're teaching literature or musicology or history of art or anything, you are opening young people to those moments when the world ceases to be a mere accumulation of facts and, as it were, addresses you. That requires literary criticism. It requires opening yourself to experience in a way that it requires a serious education of a special kind. And I think that if we thought of the humanities as directed towards that, we can see why they might be one way to fill the moral void that grows so easily in people's lives.
I actually disagree a little. I agree mostly, but I disagree a little. Here's why. I think what he's saying is truer as we grow older. That is, when we're little, we don't need a vast education to experience transcendence. Just about everything we experience is transcendent when we're 3. We don't know anything. It's not until things become commonplace to us that they cease to inspire feelings of transcendence. But of course, novel experiences have the same effect throughout our lives.
Metal plates, pots, and pans are another wonder. Rice is totally unknown. Sanjuga inspects it suspiciously.
And Gio doesn't like the rice at all. But he changes his mind when I add salt. I'm concerned when Angio begins hitting his head. It turns out to be Tulambi body language for good. When Angio does it, it is a signal for the others to try the rice.
That's how the rest of the world sees.
Can you see color?
Look, it's tripping out.
The blue.
What color is that?
That's blue.
I'm getting emotional.
So as we get older, the number of novel encounters that we experience diminishes and everything starts to become commonplace. We see the same things every day. Our lives become routine. Even things that we might not experience every day, like snow or a sandy beach, even experienced just a few times, these things lose their ability to fascinate us. And so this is where Sir Roger Scruton's point becomes right. Our ability to appreciate art, science, literature, nature, engineering, history, all seem to elevate as we learn more. Education facilitates appreciation. This is because education consistently introduces us to novel experiences. This is why some people, I think, become addicted to education. That's definitely true for me, but even more true is that this phenomenon has created within me an obsession with travel. I love traveling. And like education, many people become highly addicted to travel. Those are people that we commonly refer to as rich. I kid. Actually, a lot of the best travel people I've met make a relatively modest income. They just know how to travel cheaply, and they spend every last penny they have on it. These tend also, in my experience, often to be people who are in search of something. Non-religious, highly spiritual people who are looking to answer the big questions about life and consistently encounter these transcendent experiences that make them feel as if they're getting closer and closer to the answers. So, which strategy will help you get closest to unraveling the mysteries of the universe? Scholarship or travel? I think both can, but at the end of the day, those who have it figured out the best, in my estimation, are the devoutly religious Christians. According to various surveys, we're the happiest people in the country, and I think this is because the Christian worldview makes sense to the Christian. The Christian sees Christian ideas manifest themselves every day in the world, and so to the Christian, the world makes sense. There's no need to try to find the meaning behind everything. They've already apprehended this. This kind of understanding takes much of the frustrating mystery out of life and brings a great deal of peace and contentment. That said, for me as a creative type, I still want more. I still need to learn and grow and experience those moments of transcendence.
Both of you have done quite deep dives into 20th century totalitarian ideologies. And both of you have been very trenchant critics of the ideology, the various forms of nihilism in our own culture.
Nihilism is essentially the belief that nothing matters. Forms of nihilistic belief have existed since probably before written history, but the contemporary form of nihilism mainly stems from 19th century philosophers like Spinoza and David Hume, who proposed everything can be explained without God. These ideas were supported by the work of Charles Darwin and Sigmund Freud, who gave plausible explanations for natural phenomena. Because people were learning so much so fast about the natural world in the 19th century, many mysteries were unveiled, and people began to think that maybe the God explanation was no longer necessary. Of course, not everyone was convinced that God could simply be dismissed. Many philosophers, like Descartes, said, whoa, wait, hold on. Yeah, we might know more about the mechanisms by which the natural world operates, but we still don't know why. We still have a mystery here. What is the fundamental meaning behind it all? The answer to that question, for Descartes and for just about everyone who believes that existence has a meaning, is God. But not everyone believes that we need to accept meaning as a part of existence, and so they merely discard the question entirely and assume there is none. These are the modern atheists, and today's preeminent atheist philosophy is called materialism. Materialism asserts that we are all merely molecules floating about randomly in the universe, material. The idea is that if every elemental particle and force were accounted for in the entire universe, one could map out everything that has ever existed, does exist, and everything that ever will exist or happen in the universe ever. And so we can then deconstruct matter and energy and everything into mathematical formulas. This is the religion of the men that I call evangelical atheists. People like Richard Dawkins, the late Christopher Hitchens, Sam Harris, Daniel Dennett, and Michael Shermer. These guys are 100% convinced that materialism is true, and they want to spread their materialist message throughout the world. They all claim not to be nihilists, but without God there is no core value for anything. Without value there's no meaning, and without meaning nothing matters. Under this philosophy, no value we perceive is real. Love, a fantasy. Thought, an illusion. Your children, merely objects, no more valuable than a rock, merely a few carbon atoms. Everything is just mathematical equations expressing themselves with absolute predictability. Everything is meaningless. And that is nihilism.
We can criticize the nihilism. We ought to criticize it. Both of you have been brilliant critics of it. But what I take to be at work in both of your, in the work that both of you do, is not fundamentally criticism, but a turn towards something positive, a recovery of a sense of the transcendent. I'd like to have a turn for a moment to what does that recovery look like? Where do we start?
Well, if we're thinking intellectually, the world of scholarship and education that we both belong to has turned, as you say, in this negative direction, always preferring debunking explanations of everything, reducing them to the lowest motive, that it's not truth but power that we pursue, and all that Foucauldian nonsense.
Foucaultian nonsense. I love that. Michel Foucault was a French philosopher and degenerate. A self-destructive, self-mutilating, suicidal, homosexual drug addict, Foucault is deeply admired by leftist academics throughout the United States and Europe, naturally. He grew up in a wealthy family and was a self-described juvenile delinquent. He then grew up to be a professional provocateur. He's the quintessential entitled millennial. You can think of him as the king of the SJWs. Foucault wrote many books, but it was The Order of Things, published in 1966, that elevated him from obscure university lecturer to superstar French philosopher. Although this book's intended audience was other French academics, it actually found a much broader audience and became a national bestseller. This book turned Foucault into an overnight celebrity. In 1968, the same year that Roger Scruton witnessed the Marxist student riots in Paris, the moment that turned him into a far-right conservative, Michel Foucault witnessed militant pro-Palestinian student riots in Tunis. But Foucault had precisely the opposite reaction to Sir Roger Scruton. Foucault was inspired by the passion of the leftist students, and these riots inspired him to become a leftist political activist. In 2007, Foucault was listed as the most cited scholar in the humanities by the ISI Web of Science. This is, I think we can all safely say, a tragedy.
We're not around on this earth for very long. And we do have an obligation to find the things that we love and not the things that we reject. And that those things that we love, the best way towards them is to look at the things that other people have loved. That's what a culture is. It's the residue of all the things that people have thought worthwhile to preserve. And teaching that will again reconnect us to what matters.
This is actually my definition of conservatism. Conserving the best parts of the past. Recognizing what our ancestors, recognizing what our ancestors got right and not dispensing with it just because it's old, but recognizing its value and preserving it, or even rediscovering it. And Scruton makes a point that I hadn't thought of before. That is what culture is. It's the residue of all the things that people have thought worthwhile to preserve, and beautifully stated. So in a sense, conservatism is the preservation of culture. And that makes a lot of sense because that tends to be where these battles seem to happen. Gay marriage, huge culture shift. Conservatives were against it. Leftists embraced it. Mass immigration, it just washes cultures away in a flash. I've said this before, but if we put a McDonald's in a primitive village in the rainforests of Brazil, leftists would lose their minds. But if you introduce 20,000 Mexicans into a small farm town in the US, supplanting the previous population, changing the language, the music, the food, the religion, well, to the left, that's good. American culture, European culture to the left, it's so stained with the sins of the past that it should be destroyed. And this is often what we find we're fighting against.
How free are you? How free am I? I'd be a lot freer if people like you were put in prison as retaliation for the collective crime of racism, anti-Semitism, misogyny, and homophobia.
Okay, that guy's crazy.
Well, and there's also ways of providing a pathway forward by making the Foucaultian arguments, let's say, about power more high resolution. And one of the things that I do in my lectures, in my public lectures, that I think is rather comical, is to take and poke fun in some sense about the idea of power as the fundamental foundation for the hierarchical structures of the West. I think, well, you can think of the West as one large-scale, low-resolution, totalitarian tyranny, the tyranny of the patriarchy, or you can decompose that, which is, in some sense, is to transcend the concept. And I think, well, I ask my audiences what they think about the tyranny of plumbers or the tyranny of massage therapists. Well, because it's dead relevant. It's like, let's say you need a plumber, and you do need a plumber. Everyone agrees that you need a plumber, and because there's hell to pay otherwise. And then the question is, well, how is it that you go about selecting a plumber? And the answer isn't that there are roving bands of tyrannical plumbers that go door to door telling housewives that if they don't use their services, the service of the most tyrannical plumber, that there'll be mafia-like consequences. What happens instead is that you look for the plumber who is most able, in your estimation and in his reputation as distributed through the community, for being able to fix pipes and run a business and engage in an honest transaction with you. And that's competence. That's not power.
I've heard Peterson give this example before, and it is sheer genius. It totally debunks this Foucaultian nonsense about society being based on power and demonstrates quite clearly that our society is competence-based. It's kind of funny. Scruton maps out what the problem is and how one might go about fixing the problem, and then Peterson takes the cue and fixes the problem. These two are the best philosophical tag team since Plato and Socrates.
I've insisted in my lectures that, you know, if you're the sort of person who runs a small diner, that it's incumbent on you to run the highest quality small diner that you possibly can. Because what you're doing there is not merely providing people with basic nutrition. There's way more to the space than meets the eye. And your noble, what would you say, acceptance of your limited responsibility is also simultaneously a way to transcend that. And that can be a place where the neighborhood meets. That can be a place where tired people revivify themselves before they go off to do their difficult work. That can be a place where you can mentor your employees and help them develop their life. Like, it's an unbelievably rich microcosm. And to take on the care and tending of that microcosm as a responsibility is also a great pathway to meaning, and a necessary, and meaning is something that's, well, not epiphenomenal and not dispensable, but absolutely central to human thriving in the psychological and practical sense.
Take every opportunity you have to do as much good as possible. This will make you feel good about yourself. You will look in the mirror with pride, not shame, not indifference. You will become a confident, contented person.
But we do have to try and understand why it is that there is such a charm in the Foucauldian position? Why is it that people want to believe that all the best things, what we think of the best things in human relations, are simply disguised forms of manipulation? You know, that the whole feminist view of the relation between men and women, for instance, which is founded on this deep myth that men are exercise power as a gender, to use the fashionable word, over women, and that all study of this is just a way of revealing that power and the capillaries through which it flows. You know, I think there's a will to believe this, and why is one of the big questions that I think we have to try to understand. Is it that when people lose some kind of transcendental religious faith, that they are automatically fall into this great pit of resentment of the Nietzschean kind, to try and find the oppressor in every relationship? Or are there truths that they're exploring as well? Are there forms of power or forms of human relation that look like power from one aspect, but are perhaps also look like tenderness and dependence from another aspect, and that they've just are emphasizing one half of it or something like that? I think there are real questions as to how it is that our culture has got into this position.
There are two kinds of women in this world. There are those who accept their nature, and there are those who reject it. Gender is a beautiful symbiosis. Men do some things well, women do other things well. Together, we help each other make it through our wretched existence, as Peterson puts it. But that's only if you can find somebody to be with. The strongest, craziest feminists are always pretty unattractive. Now, lots of unattractive women find men to be with, but some of these women, at a young age, recognize their dilemma. They must compete with other girls for the attention of boys, but they are at a significant disadvantage. So some of these women, the ones who are academically inclined, bury themselves in their studies. Hundreds of years ago, it was rare that a woman would achieve the highest levels of education, and so they weren't typically welcomed into intellectual institutions. Furthermore, they weren't employed in intellectually demanding fields, although they did sometimes hold positions of power. These women were not able to acquire the same privileges as other women, because in order to gain such privileges, you need to marry a man, preferably a rich and handsome man. So in Peterson terms, they were at the bottom of many hierarchies. So where did they look to elevate themselves? They looked to the privileges of men. They said, well, we're ugly and old, we're never going to be able to enjoy the benefits of being a beautiful young woman, but because we are women, neither can we enjoy the benefits of being a man. And this isn't fair. And they were right, it wasn't fair. God had allotted them a great deal less than some others. Now, there were relatively few women who were academically inclined enough to achieve success in intellectually demanding fields, and also, at the same time, unattractive enough so not to be preoccupied by marriage and family. But there eventually were enough of them so that feminism became a thing. Not everybody knows this, but there was a strong anti-feminist movement that emerged in the wake of the emergence of the original suffragettes. These anti-feminists were, in fact, other women. These anti-feminists understood that they had certain privileges as women, and that men had certain privileges as men, and they were very happy with their privileges, and they didn't want to give them up. They knew what the feminists wanted, and they were desperately fighting against it. But in the end, the feminists won out, and they did get what they wanted. Now, here's the crucial bit. Ultimately, the way the feminists won is that they convinced men who were in power that women were victims. They were the victims of an unfair balance of power. So women got the vote, and over the years, women got more and more special protections under the law, and society focused more and more on the advancement of women in traditionally male positions. So women today, accepting these insane ideas about masculine motivations of power over women and whatnot, that's just an extension of the same argument that the suffragettes used. Claiming victim status is effective. And these feminists know it's effective because it's been proven effective in the past. And they're just trying to find new ways, however convoluted, however false, to indoctrinate people into the belief that women are still victims. Victims solicit sympathy, and getting sympathy can be incredibly lucrative.
The accusation that all there is power is the justification for use of power.
Of course. Yes.
So that's handy if that's what you want to use. So then there's another problem, and that goes along with the failure, the willful failure to distinguish competence from tyranny and power, let's say, because we might think of power as unearned authority, something like that, because we need a definition of power. And I think that there's a resentment at work there that's very, very deep. I think it's deep in the biblical sense, which is that there is a proclivity for those who do not manifest what they could manifest in the world and thereby fail to watch the success of those who do manifest what they could manifest in the world and succeed and become embittered by that, tremendously embittered, and then to label that as power and then to attempt to destroy it, because it's simpler to do that than to do the radical internal retooling that would be required to set things straight internally.
I'm sure that's right.
I'm sure that's right too.
I'm sure that's right. That's one explanation of why people are always tempted by the zero-sum vision of relations. His benefit is my cost sort of thing.
Right.
So tell me, Gordon, when does it all end, huh? How many yachts can you water ski behind? How much is enough?
It's not a question of enough, pal. It's a zero-sum game. Somebody wins, somebody loses. Money itself isn't lost or made. It's simply transferred from one perception to another.
Oh, I wanted to pick up on that, the very widespread view that things are zero-sum, which is, of course, the language of power. What's the antidote to that? How does one overturn the ideology of power? How does one transcend that with a non-zero sum truth or approach to life?
Well, I personally would say that the first thing to recognize is that there are positive sum games. You know, that's what the real theory of the market tells us, that there are whole realms of human transactions where both parties gain from their shared engagement, and though that won't drive away the real source of this difficulty, it has something to do with what Jordan was referring to, you know, that people's resentment at the success of others when they cannot match it, or cannot easily match it,
or will not match
it,
which is even worse.
Yes, exactly, and because of the labour of reconceiving your own position in such that you actually have to do something about it. You know, that there's something lazy about the zero-sum vision, but it's not a vision that successful people have. You know,
it's not a vision that they have at any level of reality, and you can actually combat that to some degree by making it high resolution again, by making examples. It's like, because very few people actually believe, once they observe, that all the relationships they've had with other people have been zero-sum. Now, you might get some very disadvantaged people, and these people do exist, who've been taken advantage by virtually everyone they've ever encountered in their whole life. Like, that does happen. But most of the time, all you have to do is remind people. It's like, well, think of someone that you loved. Even briefly, think of a friend that you've had. It's like, well, you successfully negotiated with that friend to do things together, because otherwise it's not a friendship. And it has to be successful negotiation, which means your friend has to be happy with what you were doing, and you have to be happy. And then wasn't it the case that you were both happier doing that than either of you would have been doing something else alone? And isn't that evidence in your own action and your life for the existence of non-zero-sum games? And they're dependent on successful negotiation. Is we can both have more than we would otherwise have if we can come to a consensus about what we'll both pursue. And it's very few people, when you make it personal like that, and high resolution again, it's very few people who are willing to pursue their ideology of a zero-sum reality so far down that they'll actually use that to characterize their most intimate relationships. Now, I would say that someone who does that by temperament is literally psychopathic. Because the psychopathic view of the world is absolutely that it's a zero-sum game.
I love these two men. These conversations are just so valuable. We are lucky to have men like this in the world.
But of course we have a whole body of literature about sexuality which is trying to establish that sexuality is the exercise of power of one person over another. You get it already in Sartre's Being and Nothingness.
Jean-Paul Sartre was a French philosopher and degenerate. He once wrote that to shoot down a European is to kill two birds with one stone, to destroy an oppressor and the man he oppresses at the same time. So Sartre is deeply admired by leftist academics throughout the United States and Europe, naturally. He was an atheist Marxist and a contemporary of Foucault, a little bit preceding him, and undoubtedly influenced Foucault. Sartre had a lot of nonsensical ideas. I think nonsensical ideas are actually particularly attractive to leftist academics. When I was in school, I definitely observed how passionate my leftist professors were about enigmatic art and ideas. If it was difficult to understand, they were obsessed with it. I think that's for two reasons. One, it makes you feel smart to understand stuff that most people don't understand. And two, you don't really have to understand these things. Sometimes you can just interpret them, and if most other people don't understand it, they'll probably just accept your interpretation. Some of this stuff is so convoluted that a wrong interpretation can actually become accepted as the correct interpretation. This also lends itself to the injection of one's own beliefs into some greater philosophical work. If, for instance, I want people to believe something, it's better for me to somehow make the case that Socrates originally came up with the idea. Then the idea has a lot more gravitas than if just Mr. Reagan said it on YouTube. Anyway, I'm not super familiar with Jean-Paul Sartre, but atheist, Marxist, probably didn't have the best ideas ever.
But of course we have a whole body of literature about sexuality which is trying to establish that sexuality is the exercise of power of one person over another. You get it already in Sartre's Being and Nothingness, where he it's almost by logic that serious sexual desire for him ends up as sadomasochism, because you cannot extract from the other that gift of his freedom, which is what you're looking for, because his freedom is his and not to be obtained by you. And therefore you can only do this by sort of tearing at his flesh, getting him to confess in the extremes of agony that he can't do it. You know, this kind of thing, that's a very perverted vision of what sexual relations are, but you get that image used by Simone de Beauvoir and all kinds of feminists to essentially to delegitimize the idea that there is such a thing as love for the other sex.
Simone de Beauvoir was a French philosopher and degenerate. She was actually forbidden from teaching children in France because she was caught sexually exploiting teenage girls. So de Beauvoir is deeply admired by radical feminists, naturally. Simone de Beauvoir was actually Sartre's partner for many years. I can't call her his wife because they never married. She was a radical feminist and also, as you might guess, an atheist Marxist. She wrote a treatise in 1949 called The Second Sex, which is the cause of much of the tragedy that is modern radical leftist feminism today. Beauvoir wrote, "One is not born, but becomes a woman," which I think was the first suggestion that gender is constructed as opposed to intrinsic. She wrote, "The fundamental source of women's oppression is its historical and structural construction as the quintessential other."
Well, I think it also masks a more fundamental problem that's really a biological problem. Like, it's a misapprehension of a genuine problem. But part of what sex does is temporarily subordinate the individual to nature and the species. And so there is a domination there. You know, and if a woman decides to have a child, then she is going to undergo a series of extraordinarily radical transformations, and she's also going to end up in a situation where, in all likelihood, something else becomes fundamentally more important than her. And it might be voluntary subjugation, but there's a subjugation to nature. And that's built into the fabric of existence. And I think it's very easy not to want to grapple with that because it's such a profound problem. And then to make that a secondary consequence of something like unbalanced power relationships between the genders.
But of course, our traditional religion offers you salves for this, the rite of passage, which joins man to woman, the rite of passage which makes birth an experience of the whole community, and death likewise. The sense also that in these great events one is occupying a position in a moral space that has been occupied by generations before one, and so on. This normalizing of these huge transitions, I think, is something that we've always depended upon religion to provide.
It's the sacralizing of it.
Yes, and having taken that away or ignored it or tried to live without the idea of a sacrament, and we're actually at a loss when these great transitions occur.
Well, and it is because it is the case, in fact, that to engage in the integration of sexuality with your individual life is a series of sacrifices. So for example, if you get married, that's a sacrifice because it's a sacrifice of all other people. And so it's a sacrifice of that possibility. And then to have a child is the sacrifice of all the things that you could have done otherwise than having that child. And but as you pointed out, to make that part of a broader tradition, to say that, well, that is a sacrifice and there is a loss that goes along with that, but what you gain as a consequence is of immeasurable significance in contrast to the loss.
These guys are so brilliant, I'm struggling to find anything of significance to add at this point.
And so these things that are put forward as subjugation, like the subjugation of woman to the catastrophe of birth, let's say, or even the indignity of patriarchal union, is all of a sudden something that you can take on as an aspirational goal rather than something that's a mere imposition on your moment-to-moment freedom. It's a relief to people to hear that and to know it.
Of course, no, I agree with that. But there is also the sense that in the world in which we live, where obviously people have been detached to a great extent from any continuous religious tradition, there still is a sense of loss, isn't there? People they know that they're missing something, but don't know quite how to identify it, and that's one reason for them thinking that it's been taken away, something's been stolen from them, and they look around at the people who are at ease in the world and successful and seem to be on good terms with themselves, and think of them as the ones who've done the stealing.
We have so many people who can't see a fat man standing beside a thin one without coming to the conclusion the fat man got that way by taking advantage of the thin one.
And that is a dangerous attitude, and I think surely that is part of what erupts in all these strange academic disciplines like gender studies, which simply have as their goal the undermining of the existing order without anything positive to put in its place. And I don't know what those academic studies recruit people all the time from this fund of isolation, this fund of this sense of loss without an ability to identify the thing that's been lost.
That's the cult-like element of them, because they do, I would say, to some degree prey on people whose interpersonal relationships have been irreparably damaged.
This is such a luminous observation. I think this could be applied to the evangelical atheists as well. Indeed, universities are teeming with not just atheists and radical leftist professors, but evangelical atheist professors like the men I mentioned earlier. And they are finding more and more influence with these malleable young minds exactly for the reasons that Scruton has laid out here. If you feel an emptiness and you see somebody else fulfilled, you might easily assume that whatever the fulfilled person has, somehow they stole that from you. Indeed, it may even be simpler. They may just be resentful. You have something that I don't have, and so I hate you for it. I will tear it from you so that neither of us can have it. Or maybe it's a compounding of both of these things. But indeed, atheists, the ones I see, especially in England, like Stephen Fry, Jimmy Carr, Ricky Gervais, seem to love to try to desanctify, to ridicule anything that is held as sacred by Christians. Not Jews, not Muslims really, not Hindus, certainly not Buddhists, just Christians. They see Christians as somehow in need of being attacked, and you can clearly see the spiteful resentment.
This isn't something I've talked about much in public, but here goes. This should get me in lots of trouble. So there's a variety of things that are tangled together here. So we don't know how female biology would manifest itself politically. Male biology does. Female biology is going to, and that's because female political activity on the largest possible scale is a relatively new phenomenon. And it isn't obviously the case that men and women's views of the world are going to dovetail precisely. So here's a hypothesis. You tell me what you think about this. So one thing that a woman really wants to know about a man, or perhaps you might say one thing that femininity wants to know about masculinity, is that it's not a predatory tyrant. Okay, and here's why. I mean, first of all, there's fragility in feminine sexuality to a greater degree than there is in male sexuality, because women bear a higher price for sexual misadventure, let's say, and are perhaps more prone to exploitation by force. But more than that, part of being a woman is having the possibility of bringing something extraordinarily fragile and vulnerable and valuable into the world. And the first concern might be, are you a predator? Fundamentally, are you a predator? And so what I see happening in the feminist disciplines like gender studies is the politicization of that accusation. And the accusation is, prove to me that you're not a predator. Like in the fundamental element of your masculinity, not only historically but now, because the cost of you being a predator is too high. Now, I feel that that's an inappropriate. I think that's what's driving the demolition of the idea of presumption of innocence, for example. We'll start with presumption of guilt and you'll be proved to me that you're innocent.
This is fascinating, and I think it's a very generous hypothesis about the motivations for women to perpetuate the oppressive patriarchy narrative. Peterson is proposing that it's possible that some women, maybe most women, accept the narrative because it conforms to an actually conservative mindset, which says, I'm going to assume that every man I meet is a predator as a means of self-preservation until they can prove to me that they are safe, in which case I might let myself become comfortable around them. And because of this natural instinct that exists on an interpersonal level, it's easy for women to extend this to a universal level. All men are guilty until proven innocent. Not just of being potentially unsafe for me personally, but for every woman everywhere in every way imaginable. This is where you get the idea of rape culture, toxic masculinity, and the oppressive patriarchy. And this, I imagine, could then be abstracted even more and extended to white men oppressing other cultures, rich people oppressing poor people, etc., etc., etc. If a woman's initial instinct upon meeting men is trepidation, and that instinct is being exploited to teach her to mistrust men societally, then it can also be exploited to mistrust other characterizations of men as well. These women are being taught to be bigoted through the exploitation of their natural apprehensiveness around men. These radical feminists are using fear to militarize women. It's a very disturbing prospect, and I think it's right.
I think the problem with that isn't that there are no predatory men, because there are plenty of predatory men. The problem is that the courageous way to deal with the problem of the predator is to offer a hand in courageous trust and to invite forward a partner from the monster. That's the mythological manner in which this is supposed to be undertaken. The courageous a courageous part of the woman's journey, let's say, is to face the monstrosity of a man and to invite out of that something more noble to emerge. And there's courage in that and genuine risk. And I think that that's foregone in the accusation process. And then the other element of that seems to me to be that, well, if you are a predator and you're irredeemable in your predatory nature, then the best thing to do is to render you harmless. And if we're going to obscure the relationship between competence and power and assume that all of your striving upward is merely a manifestation of power, then what we'll do is weaken you as much as possible so that harmlessness can replace virtue. And I see all of that driving these resentful disciplines in their ideology.
So the aim is the emasculation of the man.
Yeah, that's the evil queen.
Yeah.
Yeah, because we have the evil king, right? That's the tyrannical patriarchy. Well, the evil queen is lurking somewhere.
Our society does not seem to have the capacity to put that to one side and celebrate the normal. The fact that most men and most women are not like that, and that there is a natural desire and need of the sexes to love each other, to be united, and to create children and so on, and that the old stability that was built upon this has gone. So I mean that, and nobody in the intellectual world wants to celebrate that.
Yeah, it's strange, isn't it? Intellectuals seem to scoff at traditional cultural norms, and granted, a lot of people are normal. Most people do get married and have kids and make some modest attempt of being good, and a lot of people, especially in the US, still go to church and whatnot, and maybe for academics, this kind of thing is so understood, so familiar to us all, that it's not interesting to examine. And things not interesting are certainly not worth celebrating. Who wants to celebrate normal? Not even self-avowed normals like myself. But I think the intellectual elite in the West have taken this way too far. Not only is normal not worth celebrating, it has become the enemy. It has become something worthy of hostility and derision. White people in Western civilization are normal, so they must be condemned. Straight people are normal, and so they're the bad guys. Christianity is the normal religion, so it must be rejected. Men in positions of power, that's normal, so we must reverse this. It's funny, you know, I always thought of the viciousness of the left against these things as a product of perceived injustices, but perhaps the injustices were inventions created to justify the existing prejudice. I mean, certainly there have been injustices perpetrated by some white people in the past, some men, some Christians. But there are a lot of examples of terrible things that have been done by people of every race, of women, of atheists, of gays. So the idea that these groups are the ones that need to be targeted, straight white Christian men today, men who have done nothing wrong but merely by their immutable characteristics are somehow guilty by association, this has always seemed insane to me. But I think, because of what Sir Roger Scruton has just said, I finally understand this. Leftists are not incensed by the sins of the past and hating certain groups because of them. They are predisposed to hating certain people and justify that hatred through an excavation of the sins of the past. This is honestly a revelation for me. Look, every group you can imagine has a bad egg or two. Every culture, both genders, every kind of group is stained with some sin or another. But for some reason, we get, in American culture and in European culture, this disproportionately severe condemnation of the historical sins of specific groups, namely straights, whites, Christians, and men. And of course, the most severely condemned is the group with all these characteristics, straight, white, Christian men, the specific group of which I am a member. And it is so clear to me now, these have been the groups which have historically had the most advantages. And you may argue that these advantages have been undeserved, but honestly, most of their advantages were developed themselves. It must be argued that the benefits that all people throughout the world have reaped from the development of Western civilization, benefits developed by straight white Christian men, have far outweighed the harms. But nevertheless, we're the constant subject of attack from every type of leftist activist on the planet. It can only be resentment. It can only be hatred, justifying itself through the illumination and embellishment of perceived evils of straight whites, Christians, and men. And you might say, well, what about the straight white Christian men who condemn your group themselves? For that, I think there's three possibilities. One, there's the virtue signalers. Look how good I am. I'm condemning my own people even. Two, they've actually been convinced. There are some guys who are actually convinced that, yes, they are somehow guilty by association. And then the third thing, beta males trying to get girls. Never underestimate a coward's lack of integrity when it comes to trying to get a girl. They will say anything, they will do anything. I am just astonished at the profundity of this revelation. I genuinely now believe that these leftists are predisposed to their hatred, and that these criticisms that they have, all this excavation of the sins of the past, these are all just their attempts to legitimize, to justify their pre-existing resentment. Wow, you know, when you think about it like this, it makes the left seem so much more sinister. I don't even think that they always know that that's what they're doing. In fact, I'd speculate that most of them don't even realize that they're giving into this pre-existing bigotry. I think that most of them probably genuinely believe that they were neutral at one point and that they're only incensed now by having learned about the corruption of these groups that they're bigoted against. Wow, this is truly a profound revelation. And you guys got to see me have it right here on YouTube. So, I don't know, if you've watched this entire video, I'm curious to know what you think the value of this particular discussion was. For me, this video, entitled Apprehending the Transcendent, was in itself transcendent, at least at times. I mean, I certainly felt moments of epiphany, and that, to me, is incredibly rare these days. So I'm just utterly impressed with this particular video. And a lot of that was the introduction of Sir Roger Scruton, who, as I said at the beginning of this video, was someone I had never heard of and who is now one of my heroes. And honestly, I think it's one of the most valuable conversations I've seen in a long time. I wonder if you guys feel the same. Please leave a comment and let me know what you thought. I'll try to get to as many as I can, especially for this video. So, I've gotten off Patreon for obvious reasons. If you don't know what's happened with that, Patreon has gone through a sort of a culling, and they've unjustly cut off the revenue of many conservatives on the platform, and even secondary platforms that are willing to host conservatives, they've cut off. So clearly Patreon is not a company with which I can in good conscience do business. So that account has been closed. If you want to donate to help this channel, I have a Bitcoin wallet and I have a PayPal account listed in the description. And as soon as Jordan Peterson gets his platform going, yes, if you haven't heard, Peterson is creating a Patreon alternative, which should be epic. So as soon as he's done with all that, I will be on there. If you want to message me, it's probably best to get on to the Mr. Reagan Facebook. That's also in the description. Whew, that is it for me. Thank you for watching through this entire thing. I know this was a long one. I love you guys. Honestly, best subscribers in all of YouTube. I really do believe that. If you like this video, be sure to hit the like button. If you want to see more like this, please subscribe. And if you hate me, you're probably my neighbor. I am doing this on my balcony, and I'm quite loud. But, you know, it's Saturday night, and I'm in LA. I mean, it's only like midnight, right? So, all right. Merry Christmas, everybody. Good night.
Future generations of Americans will be thankful for our efforts to humanely regain control of our borders and thereby preserve the value of one of the most sacred possessions of our people, American citizenship. So now, I'll get on with the signing and make this into law. Hope nothing happens to me between here and the